And it's the end of the week. This is JCT. I'm Jim Cantelon. Welcome, friends. As always is the case on Fridays, we do a head-to-head segment either with Brian Stiller or Todd Cantelon. Today, it's Brian Stiller, who is the Global Ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance. In the course of the last few years, he's been to 80 countries and has had insights into what's going on in our world that far outweighs anything you and I will ever hope to have. And it's great to be able to have him come back after a trip and sit down with me for 10 minutes and talk about what he's seeing. Today we're going to talk about Nigeria specifically and what's been happening there with Boko Haram. And also we may talk a little bit about what's happening in Canada with the assisted death mandates out of the government. Still controversial, still a lot to be determined, but Brian has a perspective that is very unique and very much appreciated. So, right after the break, it'll be Brian Stiller. Don't go away.
This is a Voice of the Martyrs Canada news update, a special report.
What began with anti-government protests escalated into a full-scale civil war involving the brutal tactics of Islamic State jihadist militants. More than 200,000 Syrians have lost their lives in 4+ years of armed conflict. About a quarter of them were Christians. In spite of all they've had to go through, Karima says their faith in Jesus hasn't wavered.
God is with us wherever we go.
Tens of thousands of Christians have died in the war since 2011. Despite the dangers, the Voice of the Martyrs Canada has been able to help persecuted Christians in Syria, providing food, supplies, Bibles, and prayer.
For more information, visit www.vomcanada.com.
Welcome to our head-to-head with Brian Stiller. We have a lot to talk about today. Terrorism, Brian, it seems almost not just rampant, but ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Of course, most of us think in terms of ISIL or Daesh, as it's now being referred to. But Boko Haram in Nigeria, it has really been doing some horrific things to the point where I think if the world doesn't step in, there could be horrors ahead. What is about Nigeria, or is it Africa generally, that provides a kind of a breeding ground for this kind of Islamic/tribalistic terror group?
You have to go to the northern part of Africa, and in Nigeria, Boko Haram and its activities is in the northern part of Nigeria, right, which is a kind of the borderline. If you look at Africa, you do a borderline where Islam is dominant, and then where Christianity becomes dominant. So you've got these two forces that are clashing. Turn of the century, or 100 years ago, Africa was about 10% Christian. Today it's 50%. And then you've had the Islamic movement from the Middle East down through Africa. Historically, it's been in northern Africa, but over the last few years, it's began to push its way down. And these northern countries, including northern Nigeria, has been the flashpoint. And so you've got that normal tension that exists, although they have for years lived quite peaceably together. There's been times of raids and killings, but generally they've gotten along. But now you've got this drive by the Islamic group, Boko Haram, who is angry at any form of education that gives women status or brings into play what they think is Western Christianity.
Now, doesn't Boko
Haram
means no Western education?
That's right. That's exactly what it means. Yeah. So you've got these forces that are normally clashing, but now you've got the ISIS-driven mentality that what you go in and you create mayhem, you kidnap, you rape, you kill, you burn. And that has not been dealt with by the Nigerian government. It seems that they've been incapable of it or have not had the will to do it.
Now, there's also a group of Nigerians called the Fulani. I didn't know that much about them until you actually put me onto them. Fill me in a bit on who they are and what they're doing.
Well, Fulani, it's really a tribe. And what happens, because you've got the mix in Africa, as you know so well, is that you've got these countries that have been carved out by the colonialists, arbitrary borders or boundaries that have nothing to do generally with the reality of human life. And so these boundaries cut across tribes. So we've become much more tribal in the last few years, as people who have identified with their own tribes then will use their force to raid other tribes, to take cattle, to take property, to take women, and to take children. And that has created enormous struggle. I was in southern Sudan, and Sudan divided between the traditional Sudan, which was the largest country in Africa. It divided a few years ago under a UN charter between Sudan and southern Sudan. And the northern part is Muslim, the southern part was Christian. Well, we thought that was going to create a certain a boundary that would begin to eliminate this hostility. But then we found that Christians, so-called, traditional Christians, were killing each other in southern Sudan. And as we looked at it, we realized it was a tribal issue, and the issue was over cattle. And so we went in and did a peace conference with these various tribes, bringing them together, because what they were doing, they were stealing cattle, and cattle for dowry. And of course, cattle is the measure of wealth in Africa. And so a young man would go into another tribe and steal cattle, bring it back to the father, so the father would have sufficient dowry to pay for the bride that the young man would want. Well, then they would go into another tribe, and they would kidnap children and bring the children back for looking after the cattle. So it continued like a dog chasing his tail until it eventually ended up in a lot of killing. So there's a tribal issue. So you take it back to this other example that you mentioned, that becomes as an Islamic tribe, it becomes their ferocious activity with other tribes, especially those that are traditionally Christian. It's activated by their Islamic faith as well.
Now, when we talk about Boko Haram being Muslim, or Fulani being Muslim, or Northern Sudan being Muslim, Southern Sudan being Christian, Southern Nigeria being Christian, what we are learning from all these conflicts, especially on the tribal level, is that the tribal value trumps the Christian value pretty much every time. And so in a sense, referring to them as Muslim or referring to them as Christian is more of a cultural nomenclature, is it not?
It is, but then eventually that comes into play as well, whether you're Christian or Islamic. And so that simply deepens the hostility between the two groups. If you have the tribal conflict, which you have in Africa, and then when you exacerbate that by one being Islamic and the other being Christian, it only intensifies the hostility and the terrorism.
The value of one of the essential values of Christian faith, of course, is that we have love one for another. We in the West would look at a situation like that and say, why does the Christian ethic and value on love for neighbor not prevail?
Well, it does, but it doesn't. It's like in Ireland, you have Christians against each other, and you would think that the Christian ethic would prevail, but it didn't. So it's the same thing is true in Africa. But you do have, there is a growth of vibrant Christian faith within many of these countries. But then you go to a country like Nigeria, you've got some areas that are more educated and more sophisticated. Then you go a few miles out and you have a tribe that's really living in an ancient civilization. And so their notion of what is good and what is of worth is really rooted in an old tribal system. And they're in a sense resistant to the educational and the progressive ideas that come by a more pervasive Christian message.
Let's shift gears, talking about Christian messages. We've got about 3 minutes here, Brian. Canada recently has introduced legislation with regard to assisted suicide. I'm not sure where we're at right now in terms of the legislation agenda, but is this horse out of the barn?
Yes.
It is out of the barn.
But they make a distinction between assisted dying,
right,
and assisted. They call it assisted dying.
Yeah, I call it assisted suicide. Really, it should be assisted dying, right?
Well, that's what the government is calling it.
But
at the end, but you have really two divisions of that: assisted suicide and euthanasia.
Right.
Assisted suicide is where a doctor will provide you with the medication that you can take. Euthanasia is where the doctor does the injection him or herself.
So in the case of assisted suicide, that means that the barbiturates, whatever it is that's used, you are self-administered?
That's right.
Now, what about the issue of someone who's basically lying there, maybe semi-comatose, suffering terribly, and they don't really have the capacity to self-administer? How do they fit into this?
Well, that's the big debate in Parliament. Yeah. And so the bill that the government is bringing forward is trying to delineate at what point does a person who has Lou Gehrig's disease, for example, and knows that progressively they will be incapacitated to self-administer drugs, when they say to their physician, when I get to this point, then I want you to be active and I want you to administer the drugs. That's the kind of finessing that the bill will try to do to lay out the means by which it is done to keep the doctor from being accused and charged.
Will the bill provide for conscience? The conscience of the doctor, the conscience of family members, people saying we can't do it for conscience sake?
No, it's the individual, because
it has to be the individual.
We have moved, individualism is the basis on which human rights are decided. Right. And the charter of our country in the early 80s, it has rooted our ethics and our policies within individualism. So what your family says cannot trump what you say. So the individual is to make the choice. And it really is out of that individualism that this euthanasia or that this assisted dying has become a popular form and such a movement in the country that the government, in my view, has no choice but to take and respond to it, even as the Supreme Court challenged them.
30 seconds. Yeah. If the doctor's conscience proscribes him assisting in this matter, what happens then? They just go to another doctor?
That's what the bill is trying to define, as to whether the doctor has freedom to say, no, I will not participate. And if he says, no, I will not participate, are they required then to advise you to go to another one who, in fact, will? So it's a very, wow. It's tenuous, it's difficult, it's filled with all kinds of problems, but they will move forward with some kind of bill, and the specifics of it are yet to be defined.
A slippery slope, and it may see Canada becoming the most liberal nation in the world with regard to this.
Well, the Netherlands is way ahead of us.
Are they? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, there you go. Brian Stiller, fascinating as always. I'll be back with some Bible teaching right after this break.
Everyone has a story. We'd love to hear about yours. Write to us and tell us about it. JimCantelonToday.com.
Very few African mothers ever see a doctor or midwife, yet each mother knows how fragile her child's life is. You see, 26,000 children under the age of 5 will die today because they don't have access to medical care. Your gift of $260, just $22 every month, helps stock a mobile clinic and train healthcare workers to care for young mothers and their children during pregnancy and preschool years. Join WOW Mother Care now. Protect the life of a mother and her child.
We're still in John 13. The events of the Passover Seder have begun, and Jesus has washed the disciples' feet, much to their consternation. And then he has predicted his betrayal, again, much to the disciples' consternation. They don't know what. I mean, this is shock on shock. They ask who it is. He says, the one I give the piece of bread to. He gives it to Satan. I should say to Judas, and we read Satan enters him at that point in time. As I said at the end of the last program, to this point, Satan had been influencing Judas. Now he enters him to do this vile deed. And Jesus turns to him, even as he hands him the bread, and says, what you're about to do quickly, verse 27. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. You know, sometimes you get the impression these disciples were really slow learners. I mean, they'd spent 3 years with Jesus, and we're still having a hard time believing he was who he said he was. And we'll discover as we get into the subsequent events here, once they leave the upper room, that it's really not until the resurrection that they really begin to get it. Now, to be fair, I'm not sure that you or I would do any better. I mean, we're talking here about the supernatural intervention of God into the history of mankind. There's no precedent for it, and there was no, cultural lens through which you could analyze or interpret what was going on. It was all like in your face, blunt force. How do you handle this? With a master who not only did great work and signs and wonders, but also many times spoke in riddles. So, you can't blame these guys, but at the same time, you wonder, what's it take for them to realize? I mean, he had just said, the one I give the bread to is the one who does it. He gives it to Judas, says to him, now what you got to do quickly. And we read here, but no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. So John tries to explain what might have been going on in their minds. Verse 29, since Judas had charged the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. Now, here's an interesting insight. We don't know how Jesus and the disciples funded themselves for 3 years. We do know that there were many people who followed them. It wasn't just the 12. And that they were welcome in most towns and villages in the Upper Galilee and down in the Judean areas surrounding Jerusalem. They were very rarely rejected by any town or village. They were even welcomed, as we read in John 4, into a Samaritan village for a couple of days. We don't know. I doubt that they begged. I doubt that they, put out a newsletter and tried to raise money that way. I think we just simply have to assume that people who put their trust in Jesus and followed him around were the ones who supplied their day-to-day needs, everything from food to bedding for the night. Jesus at one point says, foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So he was homeless in that sense, but was always under someone's roof when nighttime came. But it's obvious here, they gave some of what they had on a regular basis to the poor. Jesus had a powerful sense of social justice. And they assumed that when Judas is being sent out by Jesus, because he was a money keeper, he was either going out to buy something that they'd forgotten for the Passover meal, or he's going out to give something to the poor. Normally, when we see Jesus interacting with the poor, and most of the people he interacted with were poor, he's healing them. He's delivering them. He's instructing them. He's being kind and gracious. He's sitting at table with them. He's being a friend to them. And in many cases, these poor people are people who live on the wrong side of the tracks, and he is vilified by the established religious leadership because of that. Man is known by his friends, and all of his friends are poor, and prostitutes, and drunkards, and wife beaters, and they would go down the list of all of these horrible people that Jesus associated with. He gave to the poor. That brings me great comfort. See, you would think that Jesus would think that he's doing enough already, for the people by the teaching he's providing them and by the miracles that he is doing, the people he's delivering from sorrow and abject tragedies of every description. But he's doing more than that. He's also meeting their practical needs by giving to those who have need. Inspiring, really. Well, as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and there's this summary comment from John, and it was night. And again, there's more to this than just being night. This was night. The darkness had descended. And the next few dark hours are going to see Jesus arrested, are going to see Jesus tried in a kind of a kangaroo court, are going to see him meeting the next morning early, standing before Pilate, and then within a few hours after that, hanging on a cross on Calvary. So it was night is a very meaningful statement. So verse 31, when he was gone, that is when Judas was gone, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once. This is all about glorification. And I took some time a week or so ago just explaining to you the concept of Shekinah, the concept of glory in the Jewish religious worldview. One theologian, several theologians actually called it effulgence, which is a strange word, but this kind of cloud of mystery and light that descends from heaven onto earth, and often will oversee the people as they gather in the name of God, kind of like the cloud covered the tabernacle in the wilderness during those 40 years when Moses was leading the children of Israel out of Egypt to the promised land. But glory has to do with awe, brightness, majesty, praise, worship, glory. We sometimes talk about the glory of, winning the Masters golfing championship, or the glory of a Super Bowl, or the glory of having a multiple Academy Award movie. Well, this all refers to something that sets you above the rest, that causes others to look up to you because you have been glorified. Well, as thin as that meaning might be here in space and time, here in this passage, it has powerful depth and meaning. The Son of Man, referring to Jesus, is glorified. God is glorified in the Son of Man. And if God is glorified in the Son of Man, God will glorify the Son of Man in himself, and he'll glorify him at once. In other words, this is going to be a glorious few days. And as you follow through the events of these next few hours, you say, where's the glory here? I don't see any brightness. I don't see any light. I don't see anything transcendent. In fact, I see nothing but death and depredation and sorrow and disappointment and agony. Well, you stop the film too quickly. Keep the film rolling. The stone will roll away from the grave. The Son of Man will rise after 3 days. He will appear to hundreds of people over the course of the next few weeks. And then he will ascend to heaven in a cloud of glory, with the promise that as you have seen him go, so too he shall return. There the glorification will become quite evident, but it goes beyond that. There's a day coming when every eye will see him and every knee will bow. In heaven, at that last day, he will be seen as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And the ultimate glorification will occur. And it won't be just the Son of Man who is glorified, the Lamb of God who is glorified, but it will be God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who is glorified forever and forever. And that's why we sing, Holy, Holy, Holy. There you go. Verse 33, my children, I'll be with you only a little longer. You look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. He's referring to death and Hades, resurrection and heaven. But he says, I'm giving you a new command. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. Here you have this new commandment. And, if there's anything you need to remember from the Gospel of John, it is this. A new command I give you, love one another. And love is not the romantic stuff of movies and novels. It's not infatuation. It's not momentary passion. Love essentially is adding value to the other person's life, irrespective of conditions, without any consideration for mitigating factors, just simply loving them for the sake of love. Adding value to their life. I see they have a need, I'll meet their need. I see they're lonely, I will be their friend. I see they need some encouragement, I will encourage them. I see they need some food, I will provide them food. In other words, you see their need and you move into the need and you supply the need. And you become a companion, a friend, someone with whom they can be in confidence, and you add value to their lives. Love essentially is an act of the will. You choose to love. Love is not just a feeling, it's a choice. And it's interesting how it applies even to marriage. I've been married now for 46 years. Every day I make loving choices. Every day Kathy makes loving choices. Loving choices are the stuff on which a sustainable relationship is built. The same principle applies to heaven as it does to earth. The principle of loving one another as Jesus commanded.
This is a Voice of the Martyrs Canada news update, a special report.
More than 200,000 Syrians have lost their lives in 4+ years of armed conflict. About a quarter of them were Christians. Prior to the uprising and then the war, there were about 3 million Christians in the country. About half of them have left, and most of the rest want to leave as well.
It breaks my heart to see what is happening to my nation with all the terrorism and the violence among the people.
If you would have come to Syria before, you would have seen how it was full of churches and beautiful Christian places, and now it's all gone. It's all destroyed.
Amani was encouraged by the concern and support of the Voice of the Martyrs Canada, but is pleading with Christians everywhere to continue to pray.
For more information, visit www.vomcanada.com.
I kind of hinted at it when I was interviewing Brian, but it troubles me that culture can trump faith. And we have to look at ourselves. We can't just look at, Christians in the south of Nigeria or Christians in the south of Sudan, in the Sudanese situation, Christian versus Christian. It's troubling to realize that in the human condition, when it comes to being under the stress of threat from militias or from warfare, that one tends to resort more to basic animal behavior than to the high ideals of love for neighbor. And I know it's easy to stand back and make that observation. You don't really know what you're going to do yourself until you put into that kind of pressure cooker. But I think it's a bit of a fair warning to us to understand that, but for the grace of God, none of us really has progressed much beyond the basic, law of the jungle. Each of us has it within us to be very self-serving to the point of, even with impunity, destroying the lives of those around us who, for whatever reason, we see as a threat. So let's examine ourselves, as the Bible says, and prayerfully consider where we're at when it comes to human values. Until next time, I'm Jim Cantelon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Contact us. Jim Cantelon today. P.O. Box 989, Burlington, Ontario. L7R 3Y7. If you're sending a check, make it payable to Jim Cantelon today. Or visit us online at jimcantelontoday.com and click Support.